All right, next up we have Ethan Linck. Ethan's a Ph.D. candidate at the Department of Biology at the University of Washington in Seattle. He's currently studying ecology and evolution through the lens of population genetics. He's also a freelance journalist who has written on nature, science, and recreation for High Country News, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and Slate. And today he will be talking about outdoor recreation and land ethics. Let's welcome Ethan.
Microphone good? Yeah. Thanks for the introduction. So as mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between outdoor recreation and conservation broadly. These are sort of the two uses that my talk's going to deal with in our framework of multiple use. I'm first going to go through and recap the premise of a recent article I wrote for High Country News, which is, if you're not familiar with it, is a magazine that focuses on the politics, culture, and environment of the West. It's based in Western Colorado. So I apologize to anyone who might have read that. But then I'm going to stretch things a little bit in a few senses and ask what, if anything, Aldo Leopold's concept of a land ethic can contribute to this discussion in particular, but maybe some of the other discussions we're having, which is hopefully only a starting point for more as the conference goes on. Okay, there we go. So my May 2018 article was titled "Yourstoke Won't Save Us," and it sort of broadly questioned the idea that participation in outdoor recreation predicts whether a person cares about the environment and more behaves in an environmentally friendly way, whether sort of recreation is a road to conservation values and environmentalism. And for many people, and myself at one point included, this is a really appealing idea, and it seems almost unquestionable, because if you are outdoor recreation is one of the most common ways people get to know the landscapes of North America, of the United States, and without sort of having that intimate connection to landscapes, how can you actually care about their management, care about their protection, care about their future? And this obviously has huge implications for management of public lands in a multiple-use framework, as outdoor recreation has very specific and potentially conflicting needs with other uses and industries. And this is an idea that's really, again, really intuitive and appealing, so I'm sure many people have articulated it over the years. But I think one of the more popular articulations of it is found in a speech Edward Abbey gave in the late 1970s in Missoula that was ironically first published in High Country News as well. And the quote reads, "Do not burn yourselves out. Be as I am, a reluctant enthusiast, a part-time crusader, a half-hearted fanatic. Save the other half of yourselves in your lives for pleasure and adventure. It is not enough to fight for the land. It is even more important to enjoy it, while you can, while it's still here." And so, despite the relatively obscure origins, the quote is ubiquitous. Partly, I think, because it's kind of a quintessential Abbey outlook. But while there's a lot going on here, and I'm not going to focus on all of it, I think one of the major takeaways is this justification we see of recreation not only as an end unto itself, but as part of your identity as an activist, as an environmentalist, as someone who cares about conservation. Recreating is as or more important as fighting for these values. And I'm almost certain I've seen one of the major gear brands use this quote on social media. I think I've seen it in various conservation groups' web pages, and it's all over Instagram. But regardless, I don't think I need to do much to convince you that that conservation organizations have really embraced the idea that recreation is a crucial gateway to develop a constituency of people who care about conservation of natural resources. For example, the Wilderness Society includes outdoor recreation as one of its hot issues. On its FAQ page, they have a section where they express concern about potential declines in outdoor recreation and how this could lead to fewer people who are invested in their cause, invested in wilderness and in conservation of public lands more broadly. And it makes sense. I really, really like the quote and the idea when I was an undergraduate, and some of that is probably the kind of psychic appeal that Edward Abbey has on a lot of young men, and the hedonism in it, that you should really sort of pursue what you want because there's some kind of broader nobility of cause you're tying into at the same time. But over time, and having spent a lot of time in outdoor recreation communities and actually sort of seeing the views and behaviors of outdoor recreationists, I began to get a little skeptical. The whole idea started to ring a little hollow to me. And in most of my life, I'm an academic biologist doing basic research, and so the research literature is my lens. And I started to wonder whether there was actually any empirical evidence for this assumption that if you're a committed outdoor recreationist, that you will, by and large, have more positive, or I won't put a value judgment on it, but that you're more concerned with environmental protection, and whether you actually sort of walked the talk at the same time. And so this growing doubt sort of was galvanized by the 2016 presidential election and its immediate aftermath, when it became clear that a lot of sort of these classic outdoor gear brands were starting to step up their own political activism, particularly here in Utah, as related to the designation of bear's ears and its subsequent reduction. And that was sort of when I got the idea to write this article. And while maybe there was a little bit of contrarianism behind my motivation, I did think it was important too that if someone was going to tackle this topic, they were a recreationist, and also I think a millennial outdoor recreationist, because there are a lot of boomer critiques of recreation that's sort of driven by adrenaline or sort of contemporary modern modes of recreation, and I didn't want to recreate those. And I'm both a schema racer and a trail runner, and sort of have the kind of young, speed-driven, modern recreation outlook, but I'm also a backpacker and a birdwatcher, and I thought that maybe I could see a little bit of both sides of the aisle, so to speak, when we sort of talk about recreation and what it might lead to in terms of conservation and land management. So what did I find out when I was researching for the piece? I won't pretend that my literature review was exhaustive or would have passed peer review. It is, after all, in the popular press. And I'll keep it kind of brief here, but the takeaway is that there's a long history of testing this thesis in various contexts in the sociological and the human geography literature. And this subfield dates back to the early 1970s when Riley Dunlop and Robert Heffernan, who were based at Washington State in Pullman, Washington, became interested in how the growing emphasis of outdoor recreation in American culture in the 1970s might relate with the corollary rise of public concern with environmental quality and environmental policy. And so they had this data set of survey responses from Washington State residents about priorities for public funding at the time. And they used this to test three questions. First, whether sort of globally outdoor recreation was correlated with environmental concern, as they framed it, or how important respondents thought it was to address contemporary environmental problems with public funds. Second, whether there was a difference in this dichotomy that predates their work between quote-unquote appreciative recreation, which includes sports like cross-country skiing and birdwatching and things where you're not really taking from the landscape, and quote-unquote consumptive recreation, which includes fishing and hunting and basically the sort of culture divide that persists in recreation to this day, although it's gotten a lot more complicated. And then finally, they were also interested in whether this participation in outdoor recreation meant that people tended to care more about environmental issues that affected recreation and sort of local issues than they did more distant concerns, like, say, tropical deforestation. So they published their findings in 1975 in this journal, Rural Sociology, and they were pretty mixed. As a sort of, the global outlook was that recreation did not do a great job of predicting people's environmental concern. But if you broke it down into its constituent parts, appreciative recreators seemed to care a little bit more than consumptive recreators, but if you broke it down even further, the issues they actually cared about were all over the board. So consumptive recreationists cared a lot more about wildlife conservation than appreciative recreationists. People who were just visiting national parks for instance, didn't seem to care much about anything, etc. And so, of course, we have all the usual social science caveats here. This is a single study, small sample size. It might not reflect much across the span of our region. So it's best understood as sort of the spark to this whole cottage industry of sociological papers that sort of take this thesis and extend it in various ways and test it in different contexts. And over the past 40 years, it hasn't gotten any clearer. There was a review in 2009 that basically argued we just have no strong evidence that outdoor recreation predicts environmental concern and environmental behavior, although there are exceptions in specific case studies. But the thing for me that really drove this home is that a lot of these papers also look at all the confounding variables that you can imagine go along with participation in outdoor recreation, like gender and socioeconomic status, and those tend to be much better explanatory factors for environmental concern and environmental behavior. So by and large, the takeaway is recreation is not necessarily the same as being a conservationist. And this seems really obvious, but it's nice to have some numbers behind this. So that was really the first point I drove home. But I was also interested in the influence recreation has had on conservation more broadly. In the United States, we've had recreation as long as we've had some sort of a public land system, and their histories are, of course, really intertwined. And so I focused on two anecdotes. I felt illustrated the idea that their goals are not necessarily the goals of conservation and other uses for landscapes are not necessarily aligned with the goals of recreation. First, I highlighted the so-called rock and ice bias in public lands, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, which is the disproportionate representation of scenic, high-elevation areas with fairly low biodiversity at the expense of less scenic but biotically rich lowland areas, which in some cases this was like a very conscious decision on the part of managers. The example I used was Olympic National Park near my home of Seattle, where there were literal trades for glacier areas on Mount Rainier for super high productivity lowland forest. And the sort of takeaway there is that obviously if we're just looking at the landscapes recreationists care about, we're probably not going to be managing them for conservation values or even any of their other uses. But then I was also interested in how landscapes that were primarily managed for recreation ended up faring. And again, I looked at Olympic National Park, where a lot of the early management regime was for elk hunters. It was set aside as an elk hunting reserve by Theodore Roosevelt. And so gray wolves were exterminated from Olympic National Park. And we've had, it's the familiar story across the West where this has had a cascading consequences, although I know that paradigm has been questioned recently. And so that falls on the consumptive side of this kind of artificial dichotomy, but you can imagine a lot of other cases in which, quote unquote, appreciative recreation, maybe for mountain biking, could also potentially not align with the goals of conservation. But despite all these caveats, there is still something really to the idea. I mean, I think probably we have a significantly higher portion of outdoor recreationists in this room, people who are obviously really invested in management and the future of public lands than you would in a random sample of people in Utah. And so I ended the piece on a more positive note, which is that there is an emerging subset of this literature that looks at the idea of place identity and place attachment, these sort of concepts in the human geography where people kind of identify with landscapes and are attached to them. And this seems to really predict better than almost anything else environmental concern and environmentally friendly behaviors. And importantly, it seems like at least in some forms of recreation, what the literature calls so-called challenge activities or serious leisure, which is kind of a funny term, like, for instance, rock climbing. There's a really nice little master's thesis based in the Shawanagunks of New York, looking at sort of environmental outlooks for people who are at the crag, twice a week. That these activities that require a lot of sort of daily practice and repetition and commitment seem to develop place identity. So I think that's fundamentally kind of hopeful and probably where we should look. And so that's where I'll leave a summary of my piece. And I think my timing was good. I think there are a lot of people who are thinking about these kind of questions now, again, especially in light of fight over national monuments and the increased activism of brands like Patagonia. And I got a lot of feedback. Some of it was very positive, which I was grateful for. Some of it was mixed, and some of it was very, very negative. But one comment in particular stood out to me, which was left on the Adventure Journal's repost of the article, and it was from Chris. And Chris writes, "It seems the author has stumbled onto what Aldo Leopold called the land ethic. The author fails to pay homage to Sand County when he purports that neither appreciative recreators nor consumptive recreators apply the thinking like a mountain perspective for which Leopold advocates." And I think for anyone in ecology or related fields, being accused of ripping off Leopold is going to sting a little bit. And since his daughter Estella is emeritus in my department at UW, I felt doubly ashamed and worried she might find out. But while I was familiar with Leopold before I wrote this piece, it had been a while since I had read Sand County Almanac, so I decided to revisit it. And I think also he's an author where it's sort of like Abbey, for instance, where it's really easy to kind of inherit wisdom about what he stands for and what his writing is about without actually having to absorb it yourself. So I decided to reread the conclusion to a Sand County Almanac, his essay on the land ethic, which I remember did indeed have something to do with this discussion. But specifically, and for the purposes of our conference, I was interested in whether anything it had to say applied to the values and role of recreation in advocating for public land management and sort of helping different users get along, particularly people interested primarily in conservation and outdoor recreation. And so it probably won't surprise anyone who's read this recently or just remains really familiar with it, but it is an uncannily prescient and relevant manifesto of an essay, albeit it starts a little jarringly with a reference to Odysseus hanging slave girls, which I definitely didn't remember. I'm going to avoid the very strong temptation to highlight all the quotes that resonated with me and seem relevant to what we're talking about, and focus mostly on his definition of ethics in the context of conservation and land management, which I think is really useful to anyone who is not a practicing environmental philosopher, which I guess we may have some here today. And so he starts the essay and he defines the definition of ethics more broadly in philosophy, and then laments that we haven't applied this rigorously to the land, to the natural environment, that someone who is otherwise a respectable member of society can continue to be one even if in their private life they're horribly abusing the land they have management over. And so he then goes and defines an ethic as an ethic ecologically, he says, as a limitation on freedom of action in the struggle for existence. And that further, it may be regarded as a mode of guidance for meeting ecological situations so new or intricate, or involving such deferred reactions that the path of social expediency is not discernible to the average individual. And so this framework could encompass a wide range of possible orientations to the non-human world. Leopold kind of subtly transitions into his own particular land ethic, his own particular belief of what should be, which is one that changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. And then highlights that this is relevant because even vocal conservationists might have kind of a jumbled view of what they're actually doing. He says, it sounds really simple. Do we not already sing our love for and obligation to the land of the free and the home of the brave? Yes, but just what and just whom do we love? Certainly not the soil. And I think this message is the one that's most often taken away from the essay, but it's a little bit editorialized. And arguably that limits how we see the concept of land ethics more broadly in the public arena. And I would guess that despite my best efforts at parties, very few people alive in the US today subscribe to the idea that humans are merely members and citizens of a biotic community. But even when I'm feeling really cynical, I would also think that that most would support the idea of having an ethical framework to navigate decisions about how we use natural resources and interact with the natural world more broadly. But I would say that in my observation, the language of ethics is really lacking from contemporary debates about conservation. So, for instance, responding to the reduction of Bears Ears, Peter Metcalf of Black Diamond described it as being, quote, a real tragedy to tear up this place that is rich with dinosaur bones, cultural antiquities, and is a sportsman paradise. That's not the best use of the land. Patagonia, this is a screenshot from their website, meanwhile highlighted that the reduction could, quote, have a devastating impact on local economies and the multi-billion-dollar outdoor recreation economy that America's public lands and waterways support. So both these anecdotes, I think they're useful because they traffic more in what Leopold termed expediency than they do in ethics. So the takeaway is that land is uses, obviously, that's why we're here, and we should make use of it in the best possible way. We just happen to disagree with what those uses actually are. But what's less clear is how restrictions on freedom of action should be in place and freedom of individual action. And which is not to say that I don't understand the necessity of having economic arguments and arguments about use that are, on face value just about use. But I think in some cases it's not sufficient, especially when we're dealing with deeply entrenched interests. And if you avoid a really clear description of the values you're bringing to the table, a sort of moral language, you can run into problems. One example of this I really like is the really toxic debate over wilderness status for boulder white clouds in Idaho, strongly opposed by local mountain bikers after a broader national monument deal fell through, and you had kind of a strange scenario where the Wilderness Society and local Republican politicians ended up advocating for wilderness status. because the Republicans wanted to oppose sort of top-down national monument status, and the Wilderness Society always just wanted wilderness because it's the highest form of protection. And I'm sure that there would have been a lot of arguing no matter how it was framed, but I can't help but think that maybe if people had come to the table with a little bit more of an ethical framework, some of the animosity would have been reduced. That if people kind of came with this language of ethics, that might help in some way. And so basically, I think it raises the question of to what extent are recreationists willing to limit their own freedoms for other values, particularly conservation. I don't think there's necessarily an easy answer to this, but I think it's a helpful thing to ask. Because fundamentally, I do think that recreation can have a different relationship to public lands than purely extractive industries, and that maybe as we examine conflicts of multiple use, we can be informed by the language of the land ethic, even if we don't take Leopold's land ethic word for word. And I think recreators do commonly put self-imposed limits on their own freedom for these other values. Just off the top of my head, in Boulder's Flatirons, you have pretty voluntary avoidance of raptor nesting areas during that time of year. And that as we kind of learn to consider our impacts and choices on landscapes as the consideration of the rights of the non-human world, we can also maybe learn how to better mediate conflicts within the human community. So if you'll allow me one last Leopold quote, "No important change in ethics was ever accomplished without an internal change in our intellectual emphasis, loyalties, affections, and convictions. The proof that conservation has not yet touched these foundations of conduct lies in the fact that philosophy and religion have not yet heard of it. In our attempts to make conservation easy, we have made it trivial." And that's all I got. So I think we have plenty of time for questions.
All right, once again, we have about 5 minutes for questions.
You mentioned the language, they came to the table with the language of ethics. Can you expand on that just a little bit for those of us that it's been 20 years since we read the second time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I might leave that a little hand-wavy, but I think what I'm sort of getting at is first coming to the table not with the expectation that everyone on a mechanistic level wants the same thing, and that the answer is just protect the land, but sort of like what are we actually valuing? Which is it as simple as we just want wilderness and we just want mountain bike trails? Or is there an area of overlap where we want this landscape to continue providing certain things? We want this landscape to be a home for wildlife, sort of coming from a values-oriented perspective as opposed to like strictly a policy outcome perspective.
I think it matters less, but does anybody ask the question the other way around? Does a base of conservation or environmentalism lead to more recreation in the outdoors?
That's a really interesting question that I haven't thought about. I haven't seen anyone ask that. It does seem like there might be some reciprocal causality there. Yeah.
Can you talk about the response that was written to your article, Yourstoke Will Save Us?
Oh, there was one article that High Country News ran. It was also posted again on the Outdoor Journal, and I forget the author's name, but he's involved in an advocacy organization that tries to get. He's a whitewater kayaker, like a pretty accomplished whitewater kayaker, and basically he's involved in an organization that tries to connect whitewater kayaking whitewater kayakers with environmental activism, and he sort of argued kind of just across the board that I was wrong, that Stoke will save us because of his experiences with whitewater kayaking. But I think ultimately we probably had more overlap than his article suggested, which was he sort of described the fact that these whitewater kayakers who are incredibly committed and like sort of visit landscapes on a daily basis eventually develop kind of attachment and want to protect them, which I think is sort of where I got to at the end of the article anyway. So.
Let me take another run at this, bringing ethics to the table. A lot of us come to environmental situations with a boatload of data in our hands, and other people come with cultural and legacy. And if I hear you right, perhaps you're saying that you could come to it with a what's right for the land perspective. Is that the ethics that you're driving at?
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is that maybe not everyone's going to come to the table with the same idea of the importance of what's right for the land and how you weigh that against cultural values and sort of other ethics, and understanding people's individual land ethic and sort of what the extensive limitation on human action are, like how much one prioritizes a land ethic relative to, say, you know, the heritage of ranching or all these other value systems we could throw at it, that might sort of build a mutual understanding